The research station hummed with a low, constant thrum, a sound Arthur had long since ceased to consciously register. It was the ambient noise of meticulous order, of climate control systems diligently maintaining the integrity of countless historical documents. Rows of shelves, reaching towards the high ceilings, stretched into the distance, each section precisely labeled, every artifact catalogued with unwavering precision. Arthur moved between them with the quiet efficiency of a mechanism designed for a singular purpose. His movements were economical, his gaze sharp, sweeping over the spines of ancient tomes and the protective casings of fragile parchments. Today, his focus was on the newly designated Anomaly Archive project. The directive from the chief archivist had been vague: collate and cross-reference all historical accounts detailing inexplicable collective phenomena, impossible architectural descriptions, and recurring symbols across disparate cultural records. Arthur approached it as he did all tasks, a logical puzzle, a vast data set awaiting organization. He saw himself as a filter, sifting through the noise of human history to identify patterns, however obscure. His workstation was a fortress of calm efficiency. 3 monitors displayed open databases, their interfaces clean and stark. A stack of digitized microfilms, newly arrived, waited for his scrutiny. He adjusted his glasses, a familiar gesture, and began. The first cluster of documents involved reports of mass hysteria. He started with the dancing plague of 1518, a well-documented incident in Strasbourg where hundreds danced uncontrollably for days, some to their deaths. Arthur cross-referenced it with similar outbreaks: the Tarenteism of medieval Italy, the Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962. He logged the symptoms, the proposed causes, often attributed to divine wrath or demonic possession, and the eventual, abrupt cessation of the phenomena. His fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting data points into a custom-built relational database. He noted the common thread of involuntary, prolonged physical activity, often accompanied by disorientation and a complete disregard for self-preservation. Next, he delved into architectural anomalies. A series of fragmented Babylonian tablets described a ziggurat whose dimensions defied the known mathematics of the era, its internal structure twisting into Escher-like impossibilities that caused acute vertigo in those who merely read the descriptions. A later discovery, a Coptic manuscript from the 4th century, detailed a monastic complex in the Libyan desert that, according to the text, folded space upon itself, allowing a single doorway to open into multiple, contradictory chambers. Arthur meticulously extracted the descriptive elements, non-Euclidean geometry, paradoxical spatial relationships, and the consistent psychological distress reported by observers or inhabitants. He found himself sketching rough, impossible diagrams on a scratchpad, trying to visualize the descriptions, a faint headache beginning to throb behind his eyes. He dismissed it as eye strain. The final category, recurring symbols, proved to be the most fragmented and, initially, the least compelling. He found a specific, intricate spiral motif carved into Neolithic megaliths in Brittany, etched into the jade funerary masks of the Olmec civilization. Painted onto the interior walls of a submerged structure discovered off the coast of Japan, carbon dated to a period before any known seafaring culture could have constructed it. The symbol was not a simple helix, but a complex, multi-layered design, its lines seeming to converge and diverge simultaneously, creating an optical illusion of depth and movement. He catalogued its appearance, its geographical dispersion, and its temporal incongruity. Days bled into a week. The initial academic curiosity that fueled Arthur's work began to subtly shift. He had anticipated disparate curiosities, anomalies that, when grouped, would merely highlight the vast spectrum of human irrationality. But as the database grew, a pattern, faint yet insistent, started to coalesce. It was not a direct correlation, but a thematic resonance, a shared quality to the impossible. He noticed that the accounts of collective madness often mentioned a shared sensory experience preceding the onset, a low, resonant tone or a specific visual distortion in the environment. The impossible architectures, regardless of their cultural origin, consistently invoked a sense of profound disorientation, not just physically but cognitively, as if the structures themselves were designed to unravel the observer's grasp on reality. And the symbol, that complex, multi-layered spiral, began to appear not just in isolated artifacts, but occasionally within the margins of the very texts describing the mass hysterias, or subtly integrated into the decorative elements of the impossible architectural plans. Arthur paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the faint hum of the research station a familiar counterpoint to the sudden, unsettling quiet in his mind. He had approached this as a task of categorization, expecting chaos. What he was finding was not chaos, but an insidious, almost deliberate consistency. The sheer volume of matching details across millennia and continents was statistically improbable, verging on impossible. A cold, clinical apprehension began to form in his chest. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was the intellectual discomfort of a meticulously ordered mind encountering data that refused to fit, yet insisted on forming a shape. He pulled up a cross-referenced report, a medieval chronicle from a monastery in Saxony describing a sudden, inexplicable plague of visions among the monks, followed by attempts to reshape their chapel into a non-Euclidean sanctuary, all of them adorned with crude, yet unmistakably familiar, spiral motifs. Arthur zoomed in on a digitized illustration from the chronicle. The spiral was there, crudely drawn, but unmistakable. He cross-referenced it with an image of the Olmec jade mask. The same intricate design. His breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound in the silent archive. He had dismissed these connections as coincidences, as the universal archetypes of the human subconscious. But the precision, the sheer recurrence of these specific, complex elements, the tone, the distortion, the cognitive unraveling, the exact spiral, across such vast gulfs of time and culture, defied all logical explanation. It was as if an unseen hand had left the same signature, again and again, across the canvas of human history. The cold apprehension solidified into a knot in his stomach. This was no longer just an academic curiosity. This was something else entirely. Something beneath the surface, ancient and patient, was beginning to reveal itself. Arthur felt a tremor of unease, a sensation foreign to his usually unshakable demeanor. He looked at the glowing screens, the endless scroll of data, and for the first time, he felt less like a master of information, and more like an unwitting discoverer of a truth he was utterly unprepared for. Here, amidst the preserved thoughts of forgotten ages, Arthur sat, hunched over a workstation illuminated by the cool glow of his monitor. His fingers, stained faintly with archival dust, danced across the keyboard, cross-referencing, annotating, drawing tenuous lines between disparate records. Days had bled into a single, extended period of concentrated effort. The initial threads he'd pulled had unspooled into a vast, intricate web. What began as an intriguing academic anomaly had solidified into a peculiar, insistent pattern. Arthur had always prided himself on his ability to discern order in chaos, but this order felt wrong. He zoomed in, then minimized the window, opening another. This one displayed a photograph of a petroglyph from a remote Pacific island, dated millennia later. The symbol, though rendered in a different medium and artistic style, was undeniably the same. He found it again in an illuminated manuscript. From a medieval European monastery, hidden within the intricate border of a religious text. The symbol appeared consistently, unaltered, across cultures with no known historical contact, across vast stretches of time. Arthur leaned back, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. Cultural diffusion was a common explanation for shared iconography, but the sheer isolation of some of these communities made that theory untenable. Convergent evolution of symbols was another possibility, a universal human tendency towards certain forms. Yet, the specificity of this symbol, its precise angles and central motif, strained credulity. He shifted his focus to a different category of evidence. He had begun compiling accounts of mass psychological phenomena. An obscure chronicle from a pre-Columbian civilization described a period of collective delirium where the population experienced identical, vivid nightmares of cities built of impossible light and suffered from a pervasive, debilitating apathy. Centuries later, a forgotten report from a remote Scandinavian village detailed a similar outbreak of shared nocturnal terrors and a profound, inexplicable melancholy that led villagers to abandon their homes and stare blankly at the sea. The descriptions of the delusions, the specific emotional states, even the reported physical manifestations, a sensation of intense pressure behind the eyes, a dull ache in the joints, overlapped with chilling accuracy. Arthur's clinical detachment began to fray. He tried to rationalize it as a universal human response to stress, perhaps a shared psychosomatic reaction to environmental factors. But the reports often preceded any discernible crisis. The psychological symptoms were the crisis. And the specificity of the shared nightmares, that impossible light, echoed too closely across the centuries. Then came the architectural anomalies. He cross-referenced texts describing structures that defied conventional understanding. An ancient Egyptian papyrus detailed a temple of shifting perspectives where walls met at angles that refused to sum to 180 degrees, and corridors twisted back upon themselves, leading deeper into the same space. A cryptic Buddhist sutra, unearthed from a forgotten cave, spoke of the geometry of the non-existent, of sacred spaces where up was down and the path forward was also the path inward. These were not metaphors. The descriptions were precise, almost technical, detailing structures that violated Euclidean geometry, a concept that these cultures had no theoretical framework to conceive, let alone describe with such consistency. A tremor manifested in his left hand as he highlighted another passage. The rational explanations, once so comforting, were crumbling into dust. The coincidences were too numerous, too specific. They were not coincidences at all. He blinked, turning his head sharply. Nothing. Only the steady, diffused light of the research station. The air in the station, usually so still, felt heavy, almost viscous. It was indistinct, a murmur of sound without discernible words, like the rustling of dry leaves, or perhaps the distant susurrus of ocean waves. He paused, straining his ears. The hum continued, unwavering. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to stand, to walk away from the glowing screen, to sever the connection to these unsettling patterns. But his determination, a stubborn core of his being, held him captive. He had to understand. He had to prove the pattern, even if the proof threatened to unravel the very fabric of his understanding. The unseen pattern, once an abstract concept, now felt like a palpable presence, watching him, waiting. Arthur stood before a particularly dense section, a forgotten corner dedicated to apocryphal texts and obscure ethnographies that rarely saw the light of day. His fingers, calloused from years of turning brittle pages, traced the spines of forgotten tomes. A specific resonance, a faint, almost subliminal pull, had drawn him here. He could not articulate the sensation, only that it felt like the quiet echo of a name he couldn't quite recall, a whisper just beyond the threshold of hearing. He bypassed the more obvious titles, his gaze drawn to a shelf tucked away behind a larger, more prominent collection. There, partially obscured by a leaning stack of crumbling pamphlets, sat an anomaly. It was not a scroll, as he might have expected from such an ancient and forbidden text, but a grimoire of considerable size, bound in something that resembled hardened, deeply tanned hide, its surface uneven and subtly iridescent under the artificial light. The clasps, crafted from an alloy he couldn't identify, were corroded, their intricate designs worn smooth by time or friction. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through his focused concentration. This was not merely old, it felt profoundly other. With a deliberate slowness that belied the tremor in his hands, Arthur removed the grimoire. It was heavier than it appeared, its weight significant, almost sentient. He carried it to a secluded reading corral, the air around him seeming to thicken with an unspoken expectation. The first page was brittle, foxed with age, yet the script was remarkably preserved. The grimoire detailed its methods, not through direct intervention, but through the slow, almost imperceptible seeding of ideas, symbols, and impossible architectural blueprints into the collective human consciousness. It described the recurring geometric patterns Arthur had observed, the inexplicable structures that defied known physics, the collective madness that periodically gripped populations, all as manifestations of this entity's pervasive, quiet influence. It was a terrifying explanation, a horrifyingly precise alignment with every anomalous pattern he had painstakingly catalogued. The grimoire did not offer solutions or warnings, only a detached, observational account of humanity as a canvas upon which the architect subtly drew its designs. His meticulously ordered world, built on empirical data and rational analysis, fractured around him. The text was not merely a historical document, it was a lens through which his own reality was now being terrifyingly refocused. He returned to his apartment in the early hours of the morning, the grimoire secured in his satchel, its presence a palpable weight. The familiar comfort of his living space had evaporated. Sleep offered no reprieve. The moment he closed his eyes, the words from the grimoire unfurled in a vivid, terrifying nightmare. The paranoia was immediate, absolute. Every creak of the old building, every subtle shift in the city's ambient noise, became an overture to something unseen. The unseen presence was no longer a vague apprehension, it was a certainty. He felt eyes on him, not physical eyes, but a pervasive, unblinking awareness. He walked from room to room, checking locks, peering into the deceptive depths of the mirror, searching for something that wasn't there, yet felt undeniably present. The explanation the grimoire offered was monstrous, an erasure of human agency, but it was an explanation, and it fit. Arthur sat at his terminal, the cool glow of the screen illuminating his face, eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. They were a pattern, tightening around him like a noose. He had spent the last 2 nights at his apartment, not sleeping, but poring over printouts, cross-referencing, sketching the symbols until they blurred into his vision. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the entity was not merely historical. It was here. A faint click echoed from the far end of the archive, a sound that should have been swallowed by the station's ambient hum. Arthur froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He knew the station was empty save for himself, the night custodian had left hours ago. He strained his ears, but the sound did not repeat. Yet, a prickle of unease traced its way up his spine. Later, back in his apartment, the unease solidified into something more tangible. He remembered placing the worn, leather-bound volume on the second shelf of his bookcase, nestled between volumes on ancient cartography. Now, it rested on the lowest shelf, angled oddly, as if casually tossed there. He stared at it for a long moment, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He was meticulous, obsessive even, about the placement of his books. He had not moved it. He picked it up, feeling the familiar texture of the aged leather, and carefully returned it to its proper place. The incident lingered, a discordant note in the otherwise predictable symphony of his life. The following morning, the discord intensified. He awoke to the faint, rhythmic scraping sound emanating from his kitchen. It was not the familiar clang of pipes or the hum of the refrigerator. It was a dry, insistent rasp, like stone being dragged over stone, yet too soft, too delicate for such a heavy action. He crept towards the kitchen, heart thudding against his ribs. The sound stopped abruptly as he reached the doorway. The room was empty, the surfaces undisturbed. His coffee maker stood silent, a sentinel of domesticity. He checked under the sink, behind the refrigerator. Nothing. The lines between waking and dreaming began to blur. He would wake to the sight of his apartment walls rippling, the plaster breathing like a living thing, the corners of the room stretching into impossible angles. He'd reach out, his hand passing through the shifting geometry, only for the entire scene to shatter like glass and reform into his normal bedroom, the morning light streaming through the window. He was never sure if he had truly woken, or if the nightmare had simply evolved. During a lunch break at the research station, a colleague, a specialist in medieval manuscripts, approached him. "Arthur," the colleague began, their voice laced with a subtle concern, "you look unwell. Perhaps a few days away from the archives would do you good. They're not just historical anomalies. They're connected. There's an intelligence, something ancient, shaping everything." The colleague's expression shifted, the concern deepening, tinged now with something else, pity. "Arthur," they said softly, "I think you might be overworking yourself. Sometimes, when you delve too deeply into these obscure histories, the mind starts to connect things that aren't there." They paused, their voice gentle. "Perhaps you should speak to someone. Get some perspective." Arthur stared at them, the words "speak to someone" echoing in his ears like a condemnation. They didn't believe him. They thought he was breaking. He saw the dismissal in their eyes, the quiet judgment. His truth, the horrifying truth he was unearthing, was being reclassified as a symptom of his own deterioration. The isolation tightened its grip. The shadow of his desk chair elongated, stretching across the floor and up the wall, coiling and uncoiling with a slow, deliberate rhythm that had no relation to the dim streetlight filtering through his window. It was a silent, impossible dance, a visual scraping that mirrored the sounds he'd heard earlier. He pulled the blanket tighter, his breath catching in his throat. He was no longer just observing the entity's influence in dusty archives. It was here, in his home, in his mind, and it was watching him. The dismissal had been a physical blow, a cold, clinical assessment that sliced through Arthur's resolve. They saw a man unraveling, not a man unearthing. The quiet judgment in their eyes had hardened his determination, forging a new, terrifying certainty: he was alone in this. Back in the research station, the sterile hum of the server racks usually provided a comforting drone, a backdrop to his meticulous work. He returned to the oldest, most fragmented accounts, the ones he had previously dismissed as the ravings of isolated zealots. A particular set of etchings, recovered from a forgotten subterranean complex beneath the Sahara, drew his attention. They depicted intricate, non-Euclidean structures, their lines twisting into impossible angles that seemed to defy the very concept of space. Beside them, repeating symbols, a warped spiral, an eye composed of nested triangles, recurred with unnerving regularity. He had studied them for weeks, cataloging, cross-referencing, searching for a logical pattern. There was none, only an insidious repetition that mocked human understanding. As he traced the lines of a scanned image on his display, a subtle pressure began to build behind his eyes. It was not a headache, but a deep, internal ache, as if his skull were too small to contain the thoughts churning within. The air in the research station, usually temperature-controlled and still, seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. It was not despair, but a cold, objective understanding of his place in a scale too vast to comprehend. His breath grew shallow, catching in his throat. The symbols on the screen began to swim, not blurring, but shifting, their static lines acquiring a terrifying fluidity. The warped spiral seemed to unwind and rewind simultaneously, a paradox of motion. The nested triangles pulsed with an internal light that was not visible, but felt as a vibration in his bones. This was no optical illusion. This was a direct assault on his perception, bypassing his visual cortex entirely. He grasped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. The sensation of immense, indifferent power intensified, a force so ancient it predated the very concept of time. It wasn't speaking in words, or images, or even concepts he could articulate. It was communicating through a raw, unmediated influx of pure understanding. He was not merely seeing impossible geometries, he was feeling them, their non-Euclidean angles carving themselves into the very structure of his mind. The walls of the research station, the familiar equipment, the very floor beneath his feet, they all seemed to shimmer, their solidity a fragile illusion. A vision, unbidden and overwhelming, erupted in his consciousness. It was not a picture, but a complete, all-encompassing knowing. He saw reality not as a fixed construct, but as a malleable medium, constantly being subtly reshaped. Not by an intentional, malicious will, but by the sheer, indifferent existence of something beyond human comprehension. This entity, vast and ancient, perceived existence in dimensions humans could not even fathom. Its movements, its thoughts, its mere presence, ripple through the fabric of space and time, manifesting as the collective madness, the impossible architecture, the recurring symbols that had haunted human history. The anomalies were not anomalies at all. Human history, Arthur suddenly understood with sickening clarity, was merely a byproduct, a fleeting pattern formed in the currents of an alien ocean. Civilizations rose and fell, driven by urges that were not their own, inspired by visions that were merely refracted glimpses of something utterly alien. He was a single cell in a vast, unknowable organism, and he had just perceived the organism's true, indifferent nature. The realization tore through him, shredding the carefully constructed edifice of his sanity. His mind, accustomed to logic and order, buckled under the weight of this revelation. The world was not as he knew it. It was a projection, a dream within a dream, and the dreamer was something vast, ancient, and utterly uncaring. A guttural sound escaped his lips, a dry, choked gasp. The air in the research station pulsed, the pressure in his skull growing unbearable. He was insignificant. His species was insignificant. Everything he had ever valued, every aspiration, every fear, was less than a whisper in a hurricane. Arthur slumped forward, his head hitting the cool surface of the desk with a dull thud. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of what he had glimpsed. His sanity, once a sturdy vessel, was now a shipwreck, its timbers splintered, its mast broken, adrift in an infinite, alien sea. He had seen the architect's gaze, and it had seen nothing at all. Back in the research station, the fluorescent hum seemed to vibrate with a deeper, unsettling frequency. He sat at his desk, surrounded by the meticulously organized chaos of his life's work, the stacks of anomalous accounts, the cross-referenced symbols. He needed to understand the rules of this new game, to find a pattern in the unraveling. He reached for a file, his fingers brushing against the cool laminate of the desk. The surface felt strangely yielding, almost soft, like damp clay. He pulled his hand back, examining his fingertips. No residue. He pressed down again, harder this time. The laminate remained firm, unyielding. A flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed. He was tired. That was all. Arthur decided a change of scenery was necessary. His apartment, a sanctuary of ordered thought, would provide the clarity he needed. He gathered his coat, the fabric suddenly rough against his skin, smelling faintly of ozone and something metallic, like old blood. He shook his head, clearing the phantom sensation. The corridors of the research station stretched before him, familiar yet subtly altered. The ceiling panels seemed lower, the walls subtly bowed. He passed a colleague, a researcher known for his precise, almost robotic gait. The man's reflection in a polished door panel seemed to distort, his head elongated, his limbs too slender, like a caricature drawn by a malevolent hand. Arthur blinked, and the reflection snapped back to normal. The colleague continued, oblivious. Outside, the city air was a cold shock, but it offered no solace. The architecture of his neighborhood, once a comforting grid of predictable angles, now seemed fluid. A corner building, usually a sharp 90 degrees, appeared to curve inward, its brickwork rippling as if seen through heated air. Arthur paused, his breath catching. He walked towards it, his steps deliberate, measuring. As he approached, the curvature lessened, resolving into a conventional angle. He turned, looking back the way he had come. The street behind him now seemed to stretch into an impossible distance, the perspective distorted, the buildings receding too rapidly into a hazy vanishing point. His apartment building loomed, a concrete monolith. He fumbled with his keys, the metal feeling slick and unfamiliar in his grip. Inside, the small, meticulously kept space was a stranger. The hallway, usually a short passage to the living room, seemed to stretch, the walls diverging slightly, creating a funnel effect. His framed prints, carefully aligned, hung at jarring, uneven angles. He reached out to straighten one, a charcoal sketch of an ancient ruin. As his fingers neared the frame, the image within the sketch seemed to shift, the lines of the ruin twisting, reforming into a symbol he had only ever seen in the most forbidden of his archives, a sigil of impossible geometry. He snatched his hand back. He retreated to his desk, seeking the anchoring presence of his research. But even here, the order had fractured. He pulled out a volume, its spine warm and vibrating. A sound from the living room. A low, guttural murmur. He froze, listening. He moved cautiously, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. The living room was empty, but the armchair, usually facing the window, was now turned towards him, its fabric seeming to ripple, to breathe. And on the coffee table, where he kept a stack of journals, a single, perfectly smooth, obsidian-like stone rested. It had not been there before. He stared at it, its surface reflecting a distorted image of his face, his features stretched and alien. It was not a breakdown. It was a construction. A deliberate, meticulous reshaping of his reality, orchestrated by the indifferent intelligence he had sought to understand. This was not a passive influence, it was an active, malevolent engagement. He was trapped in a nightmare, cyclical and profound, and the walls of his world were merely suggestions, constantly being rewritten. The fear was immense, but beneath it, a desperate resolve ignited. He would not simply unravel. He picked up the obsidian stone. Back in the research station, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and the metallic tang of ozone from the antiquated servers. Fluorescent lights hummed with a monotonous drone, casting a sterile glow on the stacks of forgotten archives. Arthur sat hunched over the main console, his fingers, once precise, now trembled with a barely suppressed energy. He had been through every document, every digital file, every cross-referenced anomaly until the patterns had coalesced into an undeniable, horrifying tapestry. What remained was less a search and more an act of self-immolation. He needed the final thread, not for proof, but for comprehension. His colleagues had seen madness, he saw the final, desperate act of a mind reaching for a truth too vast to contain. He pulled up the last unsorted data stream, a collection of fragmented audio logs recovered from a deep-sea probe, dismissed as corrupted noise. Now, he heard it differently. Beneath the static and the oceanic pressure, a rhythmic pulse emerged, a cadence that resonated with the impossible architecture depicted in the ancient etchings. It was not a sound in the traditional sense, but a resonant frequency, a vibration that seemed to bypass his ears and settle directly in the marrow of his bones. He cross-referenced this with the recurring symbols, the nested spirals, the fractured geometries. When he overlaid the frequency pattern onto the symbolic representations, a new image flickered into existence on the screen. It was a schematic, not of a device, but of a process. A method of perception. The schematic was not meant to be understood by human eyes. It was a visual representation of the underlying reality he had only glimpsed in the periphery of his research. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind his eyes, a sensation of his skull expanding. The air in the research station seemed to thicken, taking on a viscous quality. The fluorescent hum intensified, twisting into a discordant harmony that vibrated against his teeth. He pressed his face closer to the screen, his breath fogging the cool glass. Then, the veil tore. It wasn't an explosion of light or a sudden roar. It was a shift. The metallic tang of ozone became a flavor, sharp and acrid, on his tongue. The rhythmic pulse he had heard now became the beat of an impossible heart, vast and indifferent, echoing through every fiber of his being. He was no longer in the research station, he was within the diagram, an infinitesimal point of consciousness witnessing the true architecture of reality. Humanity, history, every cherished belief, every scientific principle, they were merely fleeting ripples on the surface of an infinite, non-Euclidean ocean. Its form was the sum of all possibilities, all impossibilities, simultaneously existing, a tapestry woven from time itself. His sanity, once a carefully constructed edifice of reason, began to crumble. The distinction between inside and outside, self and other, reality and illusion, fractured into 1,000 shimmering shards. He was experiencing the ultimate truth, and it was not benevolent, not malevolent, but utterly, terrifyingly indifferent. His body, still seated before the console, began to convulse with silent, internal tremors. His mind, stretched beyond all human capacity, was being reshaped, not by force, but by revelation. He saw the strings that pulled at the fabric of all things, not as conscious manipulation, but as the inevitable consequence of a vast, alien operating system. The knowledge was not power, it was dissolution. He was not enlightened, he was being unmade. The final revelation was not a secret uncovered, but a fundamental truth endured, forcing him past the point of no return. The world he knew was gone, replaced by an unbearable, beautiful, terrifying clarity. Back in the research station, the fluorescent hum seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but directly within Arthur's cranial cavity. The quiet judgment from his superiors had etched itself onto his perception, a cold, precise incision. Their dismissal had not deterred him, it had galvanized a terrifying certainty. He was alone in this, and that isolation sharpened his focus to an agonizing point. The room, once a sanctuary of ordered chaos, now felt like a pressure chamber. Stacks of archival boxes, once neatly categorized, leaned precariously. Screens glowed with overlapping images, impossible angles of ancient structures, crude petroglyphs depicting figures with too many limbs, and transcriptions of maddened ramblings from disparate eras. Arthur's eyes, bloodshot and ringed with purple, scanned the data, but the lines of text no longer held distinct meaning. They blurred, the symbols bleeding into one another, forming new, unbidden patterns. Except here, the two pictures were his reality and another, burgeoning one. He clutched a leather-bound journal, its brittle pages filled with a 17th-century scholar's increasingly frantic observations of shifting constellations and whispers carried on the wind. Arthur understood. He was living it. The entity, he now knew, did not reside in distant galaxies or other dimensions. It was here, within the very fabric of human cognition, a silent, indifferent sculptor of perception. Its influence was not an invasion but an erosion, a subtle reshaping from within. The impossible architecture, the collective madness, the recurring symbols, these were not events but symptoms, the inevitable manifestations of a reality slowly, imperceptibly, being remade. He leaned forward, his face inches from a monitor displaying a digital recreation of a prehistoric cave painting. It was the same symbol, always present, always overlooked. It was not a sound he heard with his ears, but a vibration he experienced directly. The research station around him shimmered. The solid walls seemed to ripple, the air growing thick and viscous. Dust motes, caught in the monitor's glow, elongated into impossible filaments, stretching and contracting like microscopic tendrils. His heart did not pound, it simply was, a dull, insistent thrum that seemed to synchronize with the pervasive vibration. He felt a profound sense of recognition, not of understanding, but of being recognized. Reveal/discovery, Arthur gasped, a choked, "What sound?" He finally saw it. The entity was not merely influencing history, it was the underlying current of history, the silent, indifferent force that determined the very trajectory of human thought and being. Humanity was not creating its own narrative, it was merely a complex, self-aware instrument playing a tune composed by an ancient, uncaring intelligence. The impossible architecture wasn't impossible, it was a glimpse into its spatial logic, a logic that humans could only perceive as madness. The collective delusions were merely moments when the veil thinned, allowing a sliver of its true nature to bleed through. Arthur had been trying to map the symptoms, unaware that he was merely charting the contours of a living, breathing, cosmic indifference that had always been present, always shaping. He wasn't discovering an external force, he was witnessing his own, and humanity's, slow, inevitable absorption. The hum intensified, becoming a pervasive pressure that threatened to crush his skull. He felt his mind, once a fortress of meticulous order, begin to unravel, strand by strand. Memories, facts, identities, they detached, drifting away like leaves in a gale. He was no longer Arthur, the archivist. His hands, skeletal and trembling, moved across the keyboard, no longer typing words, but tracing the sigil he had just perceived. He pressed enter, and the screen filled with countless iterations of the symbol, pulsing, expanding, contracting. His lips parted, a guttural sound escaping, not a scream, but a series of broken, rhythmic syllables. They were not human words, but echoes of the pervasive hum, a language of pure vibration. He remained there, hunched over the keyboard, the rhythmic sounds issuing from his throat, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the shimmering sigil that now seemed to fill the entire research station, stretching beyond the monitors, beyond the walls, into the very air. The distinct hum continued, a low, resonant frequency that would soon, perhaps, find other minds to resonate within, other archives to subtly reshape. Arthur, or what remained of him, was merely the first in a new sequence, a new pattern emerging from the ancient, indifferent tapestry of existence.